It's officially free agent time, which is about the time most Winnipeg Jets fans turn the TV off. Have the Jets made any moves? What's their approach to this offseason? Find out on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support and enjoy you tuning in as we continue to roll through our offseason. Now, like I said, today is indeed the start of free agency, which for a lot of teams meant that they made a lot of bad decisions. We're going to talk about some of those bad decisions a little bit later on. And obviously, for Winnipeg, the Jets have had, typically Jets start to free agency. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, we'll roll through that as well. But before we start off, just wanted to let you know that tonight's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more, because as playoffs wind down, the sports may stop, but you can still come away with a big win this summer. FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone, every day, all summer long. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Now, like I said, obviously, for the Jets, free agency is probably one of the least exciting times that we ever see. Free agency is just one of those moments where Winnipeg traditionally doesn't really do a whole lot. They don't make very many moves. You don't tend to see a lot of excitement from Winnipeg. When it comes to re-signing guys, usually it's pretty limited. The Jets maybe bring in a couple of depth options externally, but otherwise, most of what they do is kept pretty in-house, right? A couple of guys come back, maybe they let a few contracts go. And for this particular offseason, the Jets had some very big moves, right? There was some real question as to what approach Winnipeg would take, because the team has traditionally said that they are trying to be competitive. They want to spend to the cap. They're a team that, really embraces trying to be aggressive, so to speak, or at least that's what the front office says. But traditionally, we know the Jets don't really do that. Winnipeg definitely spends a decent amount on salaries, but when you look at who they bring in, it's not usually top-end talent. And free agency is always one of those times where Winnipeg has traditionally struggled to attract talent. And I sort of wondered if that was going to be a question this year, because, the Jets have gone through a big locker room makeover. Past couple of years under Bonus were a lot more successful. And with the Jets culture seemingly healed, the next step is actually making this team exciting to watch and an attractive destination for top talent. And so far, it kind of feels like the Jets have, by and large, been preparing to do something like turning the team over to the kids, which is an interesting approach. Obviously, for Winnipeg, this is a team that traditionally had a really strong cast of core veterans supported by lots of ELCs. So, on the one hand, I'm pretty, partial to this plan. I think where I start to worry a little bit is that the Jets have now lost Brendan Dillon. They've let Tyler Toffoli and Sean Monahan go. There's a few other free agents that they've kind of been cutting loose. Nate Schmidt, of course, has been bought out. And so amidst all of this, Winnipeg hasn't really brought in any replacements. The only signings that they have made are Eric Comrie back on a 2-year deal, Kaapo Kähkönen back for a 1-year contract, joining us for the first time, actually, apologies, as the most likely backup, I would say, between him and Eric. And then we're also returning Colin Miller for 2 years at $1.5 million per season, which tells me that Miller is most likely to be figured pretty heavily into this upcoming season. For one thing, I do think that's probably the right choice. Miller is definitely an upgrade for the right side, although whether you think that's a great moment for the Jets or if that's really an indictment on the right side is probably a matter of personal perspective. But all that said, for the Jets, I don't really know what the plan is. Obviously, McGroarty is still out there and still a Winnipeg prospect, which I think probably irritates both sides. As far as free agents go, though, the Jets are not exactly signing anyone particularly exciting. The only targets that they've really been linked to, there was some suggestion that there was interest in Adam Henrique, who has now extended with the Edmonton Oilers. They did not go after Jeff Skinner, who has just signed for a year at $3 million, also with the Oilers. Victor Arvidsson, also an Oiler now. You're seeing some other big moves, which we'll talk about from teams like Nashville. And, for the Jets, I don't know if I necessarily want them to go full bore on free agency. Traditionally, when it comes to UFA time, I'd actually prefer the Jets not spend a lot there. They almost tried to re-sign Sean Monahan for 5 years at $5 million per. I'm very glad they did not. I think that would have been a huge mistake of cap, resources. And he ended up going to Columbus for 5.5 by 5, every year. So I don't know. On the one hand, I'd love for the Jets to make some major upgrades. Sean Walker went to the Carolina Hurricanes for 5 years at 3.5 or so mil per season, which is really cheap. I thought the Jets probably could have matched something like that. Maybe given him a little bit of the Winnipeg tax on top. 4 to 4.5 million per season would not have been bad. But ultimately, the Jets decided to go in a different direction. And again, Miller coming back, that's great. Kakkonen and Comrie manning the net either for the Moose or for the Jets as the backup, totally fine. But it doesn't really solve the fact that we're still missing a second pairing top 4D and a second line center. As much as I don't mind Nemesnikov filling in that spot, I kind of wonder, what the Jets' plan is. With Hellebuck and Scheifele having committed to this team, Scott Billeck sort of made the good point that, they've both locked in, and Winnipeg hasn't really done a lot to try and make this team competitive. Now, where I sort of differ perhaps in some of the assessment here is that the Jets probably should be looking more at trades. I think McGroarty is going to kind of kickstart that whole shift. I think you can only get so far playing the youth because obviously, if you're intending to be good, it's a little hard to do that with a bunch of ELCs with kids who don't have a lot of pro NHL experience. A couple of these guys have gotten the taste of the big leagues once or twice before, but otherwise, most of their trade has been applied at a lower level, and you're asking all of them to step in and immediately have an NHL impact. Probably not that realistic. None of them are likely to assume the 2C mantle anyways immediately. I think Lambert long-term, maybe. But to start the season off, probably not. I would imagine Cole Perfetti gets a look back down the middle again. So there's definitely options, but I think the biggest thing is that the Jets probably should just be looking to make a trade for an impact player. I think the one that really stings is that Jacob Chychrun went to the Washington Capitals in exchange for like a third round pick and Nick Jensen. That's really cheap. I was a little bit surprised that it only cost him Jensen and a mid-tier pick. That looked more like a cap dump to me, which Chychrun is not really a cap dump. So big questions. Obviously, the Caps are, doing lots of stuff this offseason. They've brought in Mangiapane and Dubois. They also signed Matt Roy, which is probably a little unfortunate for the Jets. Matt Roy would have been a good target to look at if you want to try and upgrade your blue line, especially with Brendan Dillon leaving. But again, like I said, I also don't want Winnipeg to be super aggressive during this point of free agency. This is when teams spend loads of money, and it is debatable as to whether or not any of it's worth it. We'll talk about some particularly strange contracts and transactions that I'm really glad the Jets avoided in just a little bit. Before we go too much further, though, like I mentioned earlier, we had our friends and partners at FanDuel. I just wanted to shout them out one more time this evening. Obviously, as a sports lover, I love them so much that I don't ever want them to stop. But the NHL and NBA playoffs are both over, and that means we're getting fewer games. Obviously, there's still baseball on. The Euros are now into the knockouts, and there's tons of fun stuff to still watch on TV. But let's be real, right? All of us are hockey fans. We're all waiting for the start of next season. Although I guess for the Jets fans among us, maybe we're a little bit hesitant, just a bit. But regardless, even though the sports aren't sporting the way I'd love them to, FanDuel still lets me keep the sports going whenever I want. All I have to do is open the app and dream up any bets anytime I'm in the mood. This summer, FanDuel is also hooking up all customers with a boost or bonus daily. That's right, there's something for everyone, all day, every day, all summer long. Head on over to FanDuel.com/lockedon and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we're just chatting about lots of interesting moves and contracts and things. Free agency has just opened, and that means lots of teams are trying to do the big thing of spending money and hoping it actually turns into something productive, which, yeah, a bit questionable how often that actually works. Free agency is one of those moments where I think most teams actually make a lot of really poor decisions. Thankfully, like I mentioned earlier, the Jets have generally avoided that. That's not really their bag or cup of tea. But by the same token, a number of targets that I was kind of hoping for have more or less come off the board. But still some names out there that I'm definitely interested in. We'll talk about those a little bit later. Plus, whether or not it really makes sense to try and pursue some trades instead, because I think that's where Winnipeg's real future is going to lie. But obviously, there's been a lot of moves currently, and some of them have been, how should we say, questionable. We'll talk about some of the most interesting, unusual, and straight up confusing deals in a short moment. But for those of you who are Fox Sports or your ESPN watchers, if you find yourselves having to turn on the volume because there's too much shouting, you should make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programs for you daily to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't miss analysis, opinions, and news streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. All part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Now, returning to the Jets, obviously, Winnipeg doesn't have much on their docket in terms of major contracts, but a lot of teams have been really active. Although some of them, for fan bases, I would imagine they'd probably wish their teams hadn't made those moves. One of them that's been a little strange is the Dallas Stars. They've been active, and I don't honestly think they've really done much that I would say is good. Case in point, they just signed Matt Dumba as a free agent for like 2 years at around like $3.75 million, which I don't understand why you do that. Dumba, at this stage of his career, is like a third pairing defender and not a particularly strong one nowadays. I know that they have to replace a number of guys on their back end. Obviously, Chris Tanev has departed, and so that's a pretty big void. But I can tell you right now, off the bat, Matt Dumba is not going to be the guy who really changes that. I think he's, at the stage of his career, sort of winding down, and looking at them spending almost $4 million per season on a guy who quite realistically isn't going to be beating anyone out. I just don't understand the thinking here. Same goes for signing Ilya Lyubushkin for a little bit less, about $3.25 million per season for 2 years. Neither of these options are particularly great, I'll be honest. This is like almost $7 million. Actually, it is $7 million tied up in two defenders who are basically replacement level or at times worse, depending on the day. And I just don't think that actually helps this team very much. When you look at their blue line right now, it's Heiskanen, Lindell, Harley, and then a bunch of random guys. And that does not seem particularly great. That's actually not that dissimilar from what the Jets are rolling. And then up front, they really are struggling to figure things out. They're bringing back Duchesne for 1 year, but obviously Pavelski's gone and retired. And, I don't know, they got very far the first time with this whole group, but they need a lot more help, I would think, if their blue line is going to be this rough going forward. So looking at Dallas, I think that they're a team that kind of backslid based on so far what we're seeing out of their offseason. Not going to say that that's like a guaranteed thing, but I'm going to be honest, I don't think they're going to have that great of an offseason when all is said and done at the end. Another team that's had a much more, I would say, impressive offseason, though I'm not sure of the direction, it's Nashville, right? I don't know what's changed in the way that they have approached this offseason, but I think Trotz maybe has been a little bit spooked by the fact that, well, the Preds did really well under Brunette in his first full season as coach, and that seems to have changed the focus, right? Because Trotz, when he first joined Nashville, kept talking about building through the draft and picking up elite talent that way. But instead, they are opting to bring in a lot of free agents. And boy, oh boy, have they gone to the bank and basically taken out a couple of loans. Steven Stamkos is joining for 4 years at $8 million. Jonathan Marchessault signed for 5 years at $5.5 million about per season. Brady Shea has signed a 7x7 deal. That's a lot of money. And that's on top of a huge 8-year contract for Saros, right? My thinking with all of this is that on the one hand, yes, the Preds did just get a lot better, right? There's no mistaking that the trio of Shea, Marchessault, and Stamkos, that's all a big ad. And I think anyone who says otherwise is probably not being realistic or honest. But look at the ages, right? We're talking about guys who are at the youngest. I think Shea is like 28 or 29. Marchessault and Stamkos are in their early to mid 30s. And at least one of them has a pretty lengthy injury history. For me, I just look at this and I think, all right, you've improved a good bit, but your team is not actually at a real competitive state. This just kind of gets them to the upper part of the Central without actually making them truly competitive. Now, with the Jets likely to take a step back, maybe that was sort of their impression, is that they can kind of crawl back into this and things will be fine. But I don't know, man. If I was the Preds and I was thinking about how teams are constructed traditionally in a smaller market like that, where maybe it's a little bit tougher to attract like really expensive free agents, I don't know if I would go this route. Now, Stamkos obviously is a huge marquee signing, and I think he definitely leads the way there and will be a huge asset. I think that they'll definitely score a lot more, and I think that there'll be a bigger nuisance in the Central for sure. I just don't know that it really makes them like a top-end competitor. It's better, that's for sure, but I don't know if I really love it, right? Similarly, if you look out at the Kings, God bless Rob Blake. I have no idea what he's up to. He has brought in Joel Edmondson for 4 years at around $3.8 million per season. Whatever he's cooking out there, all I can say is good luck, Kings fans. He has not only way overestimated the timeline for the rebuild, but he has started to put some real contracts on there that I think are going to really hurt long term. Just look at the Dubois deal that aged immediately terribly. They've already traded him. They brought in Darcy Kemper in exchange, and they just don't really seem to have much of a direction. So yay for I guess being mediocre. As a Jets fan, I'm sure we have all known that a little bit too much, but still surprising to say the least. Otherwise, I think of the teams that have had really big off seasons, I would say that the Oilers have brought in some pretty solid talent. I think Skinner and Arvidsson are good. They're bringing Stetcher and Janmark back for multi-year deals. So if you're trying to round out the depth, pretty solid. I will say I'm about to vomit hearing the whole Stan Bowman thing, but you can probably guess how I feel about a lot of the old Blackhawks staff from the Kyle Beach case coming back. So I'm not going to really litigate that, but just know if there's an organization that I'm kind of actively rooting against right now, it's probably the Oilers. Otherwise, some interesting contracts. I think the worst contract of the day was probably the Seattle Kraken, giving 7 years to Chandler Stevenson. And, Chandler, like I watched him back in his Bears and Caps days, because obviously I'm relatively local, so I got to see him. And he's a fun player, right? I always liked him as like a middle six center, somebody with a lot of speed and pace and a decent amount of skill. But until he hit the Knights and started playing with Mark Stone, I never envisioned that he would be paid like a little over $6 million a season for 7 years. That's just a bad deal. No matter what happens, he's really started to slow down, and I think his ability to keep up with Stone has already declined. And now you're asking him to be one of the primary drivers for the Kraken. That's not going to end well. He could definitely turn around and surprise all of us and upset my expectations, but I can tell you right now, I don't think that's going to work out. I'm looking at that deal, and I'm just seeing that there's a likely buyout here in not too long. I just can't see how that particular contract is going to end well. And if you ask me, I think it is a huge, huge, huge mistake. But of course, I'm not getting paid to make these decisions. I'll just have to let them sort of live with the consequences. You ask me, it's probably not going to end super well, but hey, maybe I'm barking up the wrong tree and totally under the wrong impression. But all I can say is I would not do that if I was a team looking to stay competitive. But then again, I honestly don't even know what their plan is. So, hey, maybe this fits their timeline of being mediocre for the next few years. But hey, if you can take any solace as a Jets fan from Winnipeg basically not signing anyone in particular, just know that they didn't commit to anyone that's bad immediately. No long-term deals that are really eye-watering, a limited amount of engagement with the market that was seeing lots of 5 and 7 year deals at pretty eye-watering AAVs for a lot of these players. I think this is one of those moments where the Jets being relatively conservative actually kind of works out. So, fun stuff. But of course, there are still some free agents out there who are worth taking a look at, and we'll talk about just a few of those and what it might mean for Winnipeg in a little bit. Hey, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we're just wrapping up with some first day of free agency thoughts. Obviously, we just kind of went through a lot of confusing deals and signings from some of our rivals, as well as just some straight up bad contracts. The Preds are loading up, though, for what purpose I can only imagine is to at least put some butts in seats. Everyone else, though, there's some teams that are definitely adding to the top end of their roster, like Edmonton, but most teams I feel like have been spending a lot of money, and I don't know if it's really wise. Certainly raising your floor is important, but I feel like there's a point at which that doesn't really help you when you're loading this much cash onto a team that's just not that great to begin with. Now, all that said, a lot of players that I like have already been signed, but the Jets still have a couple of really good opportunities. One of the names that's kind of caught my eye is Erik Brannstrom. Brannstrom wasn't qualified by Ottawa. He's a free agent. And in terms of being an immediate upgrade for Winnipeg's second pairing or even third pairing right side, I mean, if you're looking for a puck mover with some legit offensive skill and some really solid defensive marking and offensive zone work, Brannstrom is exactly the kind of guy that I'd give a cheap multi-year deal to. If you could bring him in for like 3 or 4 years on like a sort of DeMello, like an initial DeMello deal, right? I think that's fantastic. Brannstrom, for some reason, has a reputation of being a soft, mediocre, bad defender. He's not. He's very skilled. And while he's not overly physical, I think if you're looking for somebody who can really help Winnipeg's zone exits and transition quite handily, he's exactly the kind of player the Jets should be targeting. He's seemingly being looked over by a lot of the market, and if you ask me, that's a mistake. I would prioritize bringing him in. I think he'd be one of the best free agent signings that you can get out of this class value-wise. And in terms of a guy who would also fit Winnipeg's timeline, he's not yet 25, so as a player that you could have around for the foreseeable future for like 4 years even, I think that would be really good. In worst case scenario, things really don't turn out. If the AAV is relatively low, it's a very movable deal. But I can tell you, should the Jets need that right side locked up, especially if they move on from Pionk, I think that is a very sensible choice. Another guy that I'd have interest in, although he's a left-sided player, and that obviously brings some questions, it's Oliver Kylington. I've always been a fan of Kylington. He's another guy who has gone through some personal issues over the last couple of seasons, took a real big step away from the NHL for a while. Now he's come back, and he's looking for some term, which the Flames weren't really willing to give him, and so he's trying to find another fit. I don't know that the fit is necessarily in Winnipeg, but as a player who is definitely a very skilled puck mover, an offensively minded blue liner with a great shot and smart passing and skating, I could see there being some intrigue. I don't think I would necessarily put a lot of weight into that if I'm the Jets, but he is a really quality player and could be a really nice defensive option if you're looking to really get Winnipeg's back end a lot faster. He's a very smooth skater. He's got a great first step. And I think, going forward, if you kept him around for a few years, I think you'd see some really quality work from him, regardless of what pairing he's on. So some interesting thought there. I don't know that I would really read too much into it yet, but so far, I mean, when it comes to like blue liners that you could bring in, these are the sorts of guys that I think you should target. Undervalued, puck moving, attacking oriented players who can supplement Winnipeg's forward group and offer more juice from the back end, because the Jets' forward group this year is probably going to look a little rough. One guy who could help with that is Daniel Sprong, and I've talked about Sprong a lot. I think he could potentially re-sign with the Rings for multiple years. He's a guy who just continually scores like 20 to 25 goals and then somehow plays like 12 minutes a night. I don't know how he does it. It's the weirdest thing. I've never seen a player that has his level of finishing basically be put on the fourth line consistently. If he does leave, I would be like slamming the buy button. I think he is a fantastic addition that could probably be had for a relatively lower price. For one reason or another, he just doesn't seem to get paid that much. And if I'm the Jets, I would be 100% looking to get him around for like 4 or so years. For a guy who just continually somehow gets paid like $2 million or $3 million a season, he is honestly by by time on ice and his finishing rate, one of the most efficient shooters I've seen in this league. There's really not many guys who are going to score 20 goals playing like 13 minutes a night the way he is. So as one of my most coveted free agents, and I know that sounds funny for Daniel Sprong, who's basically bounced around the league for the last several years, I would still be hot to trot for him. I think he's a great addition. I think he'd be a fantastic upgrade for Winnipeg's middle to top six. And regardless of where you play him, I think you will get a lot of value out of his offense. And again, he just has a skill set that not many players have, and that's finishing. That's something that's hard to find. And I think for the Jets, a really big addition that could honestly give Winnipeg some real teeth as they get closer to the playoffs next year. One last guy that I'm sort of interested in, although I wouldn't say that I'm like entirely certain of what his status is. It's Barrett Hayton. Hayton is apparently qualified by the Utah Hockey Club, but I don't know why his stats pages and stuff continue to have him suggest that he wasn't. I've seen some stuff on Twitter that he was not qualified, although Utah itself has said he is. So I would assume he's qualified, but if he is a free agent, I would definitely be interested in his services. He's like a little bit rough around the edges, but as like a 24-ish-year-old center with some upside and a guy who's posted 40 points in the past, I would be intrigued to see if he'd be willing to come to the Jets. Winnipeg is still looking for a second-line center. I don't know if Hayton is necessarily the guy to do that, but in terms of players who do still have some projection for some growth and, maybe could really thrive in a squad like this where you've got some startling young talent to potentially work with, maybe Hayton would really shine away from Utah's roster. Playing with Cole Perfetti or Kyle Connor, or if Ehlers is still around by then, maybe Nick or somebody like that, I could see that being really interesting. I think the Jets have some real options here to pair him with, and I think he could be a really quality two-way finisher for the Jets, although again, it depends on what his contract status is. I'm operating under the assumption that he is actually qualified if Utah itself said they did it, but hey, maybe strange things happened and there was a miscommunication. But all that said, I'd be curious to know what players you're still interested in. Are there free agents that you're after? I think, for me, the biggest thing is that the Jets should probably go more for trades. Sprong, Brandstrom, guys like that aside, there's just not free agents out there that I would spend a lot of money on. Go for trade assets, look for RFAs that are maybe on the verge of not signing with their teams and out of favor, but could still be big upgrades for the Jets. Maybe David Jiricek is the time, to really go for that. With Columbus doing stuff, who knows what it is that they're doing. Maybe this is a way that you could really lift him out of there in a McGroarty swap. I think that there's lots of options. I think Montreal has also inquired, although I would not really want to do that. But there's still time for the Jets to upgrade this team and get ready for next season. I think the initial panic over the free agency period being quiet probably shouldn't be something you have to worry about too much. Just be patient. The Jets didn't lock themselves into any bad deals. They've still got some really good cap space, and they may be able to make here a bit more if they move Pionk over the next couple of weeks. But let me know what free agents you're after. Who do you hope the Jets trade for? Drop your thoughts and comments below or at my social medias at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets on Twitter. For tonight's episode, though, that's going to be all the time that we have. I thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day, every day. We'll see you back here tomorrow for day 2 of free agency and hopefully a few more Jets moves.